I still have something against the form of psychological therapy in that aspect of it, because you are battling psychological issues with more psychological advice, and that's just redundant to me, which I
Mm,
think is a comes with a great deal of responsibility.
yeah.
And for me to have seen the psychologists that I've met in my life, which is plenty, I have never observed not one that can really look at their own psychology from a very drawn out perspective and in the way that I'm talking about. If this
Yeah.
gets clipped and they hear that I'm talking about this, it won't make sense. You need to watch this whole podcast to understand what I'm saying. The aim of this podcast is to bring attention to what modern day humans ignore. Living lives in fabricated personalities, enslaved to compulsion. The facets of the human animal have to be rediscovered. We need to wake up. I am excited to bring you the Evolution Podcast. The what part is the 50% that you're giving to
Okay.
somebody?
So,
What is that quality that you give?
okay. So let's assume like the assumption that we're making when I'm saying this is that we're composed of 100% of something, arbitrary units, 100%, right? And for the sake of argument, we're going to say that 100% is emotional fluency, is what we're talking. Emotions. Let's just take emotions, period. Not in the conventional sense, but some emotional currency, 100 units of that emotional currency makes up who we are. And we spend that emotional currency to gratify ourselves, which is beyond the physical, which is beyond anything else, and which is not necessarily at the level of spiritual yet. It's the most easily tradable currency for people like us who are fluent with our emotions. So, with this emotional currency, we tend to spend an arbitrary amount depending on the kind of people that we are and depending on the amount of validation that we seek. So, with me and relationships, how it's always been, obviously because of the way that I see relationships, having grown around in my family and my community, I romanticize them a lot. It's very easy for me to give a large portion of my emotional currency to someone
Mm,
in the very early stages of the relationship,
mm,
and then pretend like I've done my part, that's it, my hands are clean, now it's up to them to do things
mm,
for me. Which
mm.
is why even the smallest upsets that I feel in the relationship, even the smallest hurdles, are quite big, because 50% of my emotional currency has already been spent. I've invested so much in my mind already in this person, and now even if this person decides to say be late for a date, or you know isn't speaking to me the way in the same tone of voice that I she spoke to me yesterday, I feel like they're upset. It's going to upset me quite a bit more. So that's me and my kind of people, which is a large investment in the very early stages of the relationship.
Ah, I see what you're saying. So this, okay, wait. Let me gather what you're saying. You're saying this emotional
Yep.
currency that you're spending is
Yep.
almost, it's like, I wouldn't say currency is the right word, but I think I'm trying to,
Yeah. Just
I
for the
understand what
ease
you're saying.
of explaining it to you, let's just say.
Let me try to articulate what you said.
Yep.
You're saying that there's a part of you that you lend to someone,
Hmm.
and then that
They don't
lending.
return this part to you, by the way. So imagine a liver. You cut a
Mm.
liver in half, it grows back, and it takes time. The larger
Does
portion
it
of the liver
actually?
that you, yeah, it does. It's a regenerating organ.
A human liver?
Yeah, this is why liver donations are so easy. You just cut a part of the liver and you give it to the other person that matches the blood type, and the person's liver grows back over time.
Fuck.
Yeah.
So, okay,
So
wait. Before you say anything, you're saying you're lending this part of yourself to somebody, willingly, or because your identity is programmed in such a way that you want to romanticize certain things, so that percentage of what you're giving changes depending on how much you value that, either psychologically or actually.
yeah, you've got most of it right. So the value, the person that you give does depend on the value and does depend on your identity. So both those things determine how much percentage you're willing to bet on this person.
Yeah, yeah,
But you're not lending a part of anything. You're giving it away literally.
giving it away.
You're
Yeah.
giving it away with the inherent expectations that you already have, that when you're giving it away, you're not necessarily expecting reward, like a specific reward, but there is a notion that a reward will be received, so you're
Mm,
giving it with the expectation that you'll be rewarded for it.
right, right.
right? And that reward comes in the form of your gratification.
And so the expectancy is the currency that
Yes.
you're
So
spinning it.
yeah, so the slower you give it, the less you're thwarted. And when you if
Mm,
it's like you're spending, you put a pound in shares, a share goes down, not as bad. You put £1,000 in shares in the beginning, it hits you
mm,
more. Even
mm,
though you still have money in the bank, you've
mm,
just lost more. And
mm,
that expectancy that you get back, and the gratitude, the expectation of gratitude that you feel, that is different for each person. So my expectations from a relationship to be gratified are different.
mm,
And we've already seen that your expectations to be gratified in a relationship are different.
mm,
And not only that, the way that we spend this currency, or well, not currency, but the way that we spend this arbitrary amount is also different between the two of us. Like I said, I give 50% or a large portion of my expenditure in the early stages of the relationship, and I'm like done and dusted. It's their problem now. They're going to need to make it up to me. Well, for you, I suspect that you give it a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time. But um, now the point is, for me, even though that's my method of giving, my first relationship, I might have given 50% of myself, and then I
mm,
didn't get all of it returned, so my expectations were thwarted. And then maybe at the end of it, I came out with 70% of my currency still left to spend. When came along, I gave her not necessarily 50%. I gave her less of that, but then she took more away from me. So I was
mm.
left with less than I started. So maybe like I had 20% of me left at the end of it. But when came along, I gave her more than 50%. So the sum that I'm providing these
Yeah,
individuals
yeah, yeah.
is
I
changing because
I
of the value that I want to put in them, and the
but it
value that I think they'll give me.
but it's also important to understand that when you say didn't give you back something or didn't give you back something,
Yeah.
that your expectancy is what is the
Yeah.
opposite currency to what you are giving away.
Yeah.
So if
So
you are giving
imagine.
that 50% away to somebody, the
Yeah.
reason that you won't get it back is because of how much expectancy you have
Yeah.
from giving that
So
away.
obviously we're operating under the assumption that the only reason we're giving it away is with the tied expectance of gratitude
So
or gratification.
do you think that somebody can give that away without having expectancy?
No, that would be a huge leap from conventional human understanding at the minute because so let's assume, right, in that particular circumstance of this person does not want to be gratified. That's what it mean, which means that they can give it away, but they're not spending the gratification currency.
Mm.
That's they've kept 100% of
I
themselves.
feel like I'm in that position right now, where I feel like I'm giving away some part of it, but that expectance for gratification is very, very minimal. Or I'm receiving things that I did not expect anyway.
Yeah. So the more likely scenario is that you're there's a currency equilibrium that's going on. You're literally giving and receiving at the same rate, if not receiving more than you're giving.
Mm,
And you might not be able to pinpoint and
recognize that.
identify it
Right.
at the minute. It's
Yeah.
easier to recognize loss than gain.
Mm, I understand.
So yeah, so the offset is tipping in your favor at the minute. So it
Yeah.
might seem like you're in control, but when the rug gets swept off your feet, you'll then realize that, oh no, I was actually spending this
That's
amount.
a beautiful line, man. It's easier to recognize loss than gain. That is so
Yeah, it
true.
is. It is. It is. That's just the way that we function as human beings. We're very fine tuned to detect and save ourselves from potential threat. But
Mm,
then you'll see that we're very awkward in situations where we're being flurried with a lot of comfort and luxury, and you're like, we don't know what to do with it.
yeah.
Especially people like us that grew up from shit. We're just like, we don't know what to do with all this comfort. We just want to put it into something that'll progress more and more and more, and that's how we survived over time. But which is why trust fund kids or people that grew up in very cozy environments, even the slightest bit of turbulence will offset their balance and they'll get fucked up. Emotionally unavailable people. That's how emotionally unavailable people are formed. They're
Mm,
forged in this concept of, oh, I'm not going to give any bit of my currency. I'm not going to spend any bit of my currency, even if I'm getting stuff back. They're not going to recognize it because they've been through so much loss. They just refuse to recognize gain. I suspect that's part of the reason what happened with and I, because we're literally two opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of this currency expenditure. She's just been going through so much loss during the time. It's just she couldn't recognize what I was giving her at the minute, and therefore she just took it in a way that she would rather pull back than to reciprocate it. And on the opposite end of my spectrum, I already gave her my 50%, and now I was expecting a lot in return, and I didn't get any bit of it at all.
One thing that you said was interesting. That you said when somebody doesn't return this to you, people want to give it less and less. What if
Yeah,
there was a situation where somebody understood that that's unhealthy for you? I think let's start from the foundation of what you are giving again, right?
yeah,
If you are giving something, um, I think that there is always something to give, and the analogy of saying that I'm giving something and expecting something in return, the
yeah,
expectance is what causes it to be limited. But if
yeah,
the expectance does not exist as much, then the
yeah,
limitations of how much you can give is limitless, I think.
yeah,
And so when you're giving something to somebody and you don't expect anything and you get
yeah,
something, fine, you don't recognize it as much as loss. I agree with
yeah,
that. When unless you're trained to be grateful.
yeah,
If you give something to somebody and you don't receive it back, then that pain of the loss is definitely recognizable.
yeah,
But say somebody was to make a conscious decision to understand that that expectance, even after having the loss, you can negate that loss by saying, okay, that was my expectations. And
yeah,
since I know that I created those expectations, I can negate this loss by reprogramming myself to understand that the expectations that I had in the first place were false. And
yeah,
so what happens after you've done that loss, if you are able to successfully program yourself to realize that that expectance was uh, came that the loss comes from expectance, then you can negate that. So when you do
yeah,
negate that, you have like now another whole to give to somebody. But that whole to give to somebody comes, and when I say whole, I mean WHOLE, whole.
yeah,
Give to somebody, and then when you give that whole to somebody, you recognize that, oh, each time that I do this, especially with more and more experience that you
yeah,
recognize loss from, each time that I do this, I'm able to recover. Some people need more time to recover from something that's been lost from them, like quote unquote lost.
yeah,
And some people don't need that much time. They can move from relationship to relationship in a very um, giving way. They
yeah,
always have a lot to give. So if you do have that whole piece of you to give again soon
yeah,
enough, then you start to realize the more and more you do that, the less significance you attach to the fact that you're losing something and that you always have something to give. And
yeah,
so when you always have something to give and you realize that that loss is really just your psychological limitations,
yeah.
then the concept of expectation starts to die down, and that's what happened to me. That's how I realized that the less you expect, and not even as a conscious decision that the less you expect, just in terms of understanding that expectation is what is causing that loss.
Well, so the only distinction that I want to make there is that expectation comes from a place of ego. It's very superficial,
Yes.
whereas this feeling of understanding gratitude and being grateful and making that decision that you want to offset your loss of expectations with gratitude comes from a place of not playing with your ego, not
I
talking through
wouldn't
your
say
ego.
you're offsetting it with gratitude. I still think that gratitude is an egoistic form of a feeling.
Yeah.
Although it's
So
learned, I don't think the offset is from the gratitude. I think the offset is from just understanding that expectation is coming from ego. Simply is that.
yeah, yeah. So that's why I was attaching the feeling of gratitude to the egotistic perspective of expectation in the first place. So this whole premise that I'm building, it completely just revolves around the fact that we're placing this amount of expectation on another person. And the reason we're placing this expectation on another person is because we deserve to be, or we feel like we deserve something in return. It's this barter system that's built over time, and that's how we've been conditioned to be, where we need to receive something in return for something that we give. And the significance of the thing that we're providing will determine the significance of the expectation of what we feel in return.
Yes, in a common human being, but I'm the preface that I'm building here is to understand when the human recognizes that that barter system is from expectation. If you were to remove that expectation and you were recognizing that a human can give as much as they want to,
Yeah.
and they don't truly have a loss, because let's understand that that loss also is an attack on your
So
ego.
that I feel like that would only apply if this person derives gratitude from just giving. That is the only situation where this would apply.
I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
Let me absorb that for a minute.
Yep. Whilst you absorb that, I was just going to say that was the same principle that I used initially, and I still stand by that philanthropists only do it to gratify themselves because
I agree with you on that.
the closest example to that would be that.
I agree with you on that. There's conditioning of gratification in that environment. But when it comes to somebody who's gratified by only giving, yes,
Yeah.
that makes sense on an egoistic standpoint.
Yeah. Yeah.
But by giving, I still want to separate the meaning of giving as to providing and
Yeah.
giving as to how much of yourself that you're giving in the first place. Because when we're talking about giving in this context, we're talking about that 50% or whatever percentage that you were talking about. So it's not
Yeah.
necessarily some value that you're providing. It's not bringing value to that other person. It's just you sharing that side of yourself.
Yeah.
So it's not something
So
that you
okay,
can be
no, you're not necessarily sharing that side of yourself. Again, that's the another distinction that I want to make.
giving. I would say giving.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
literally, because if it was sharing, right? If it was a mutually accepted norm of okay, I am lending, I'm loaning, I'm sharing, then the expectations need not, like, it doesn't take a
Yeah.
lot for you to thwart those expectations. You're like, okay,
Agreed.
this is
Agreed.
this is something that, yeah. But when you're giving something away, this whole concept of you take this now, you keep it with you, I don't want that back, so I'm giving you a portion of myself for
Yes.
you to
Yes.
keep, which
Yes.
is so significant because there's nothing that you value more in this lifetime than yourself. And you're saying, take a part of that and keep it with you, and I don't want it back. So, the significance that I'm trying to portray here is that you've given them so much in so little, and you don't even think about it when you're doing it.
See, but
But
that's contradicting the statement of expectation. So if we're talking about the norm of people giving,
yeah,
then I think we have to use the word sharing. Because when you share, then you expect something. Not necessarily, but I guess there are better words to say that. But I still wouldn't say it's giving without expectation because the way that you just defined it now is
no, I
unconventional.
didn't. I didn't say without expectations. I said you're giving a large and significant portion to them
Yeah, but
with
you
the
said keep
expectation.
it. But you said
Yeah, I
keep
said
it, and
keep
I
it.
don't
Yeah,
want it
you
back.
have to. You have to keep it. You
So you
have to
don't
keep
want
it.
it back, but you
No,
want
yeah,
to propose
exactly.
back. So
So
it's a
the
barter.
reason I want them to keep it and I don't want to take it back is now that puts me, they
Give me
makes them
something.
liable to give me something back. So there has to be an
Yeah.
expectation. There has to be something that you gratify me with.
I, I
That is the basic of how this works.
I think there has to be an expectation, and by that you mean that in general, when you observe the way that people work, there is expectation. I don't think that you're saying that that's the way it's supposed to happen. But
No, yeah, 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 yeah.
I'm still not. I want to get back to what we were talking about. If somebody understands that the concept of expectation is what is creating that loss, then without attaching gratitude to the fact of giving something,
Yeah,
instead of gratitude, do you see that there lies weakness? That you see, like expect, I mean, try to understand what I'm saying here.
go on.
Decode this sentence. If
Yep,
somebody is giving something to someone and they have
yep,
understood that the expectation is what is causing loss, and they don't
yep,
want loss,
yes.
either they are giving because they are trained to receive dopamine from giving, or they are weak without having that side to themselves.
Or they're just risk takers. Human
I
beings are
don't. I
risk
don't think
takers.
so. I don't think so. Because most people cannot live without that. Because why do you think they compulsively give themselves to other people?
We're arguing from a standpoint, or not arguing, but we're talking about it from a
Yeah.
standpoint of either these people are risk takers, which I think, or these people are just trying their best to keep themselves comfortable. Now we then have to decide whether this concept of taking in another human being and then sharing experiences with them leads into or pa- paves a path towards comfort, or it paves a path towards the unknown. Relationships, in my opinion, go guide us towards something of an uncharted territory. We don't know where
I
it
agree
goes.
with you. In reality, they guide us to uncharted
Uncharted
reality.
territory.
But in your psychological reality, when you're going into it, you think that you want to go to where you're going. So you, in
Yeah.
reality, you are going somewhere that you don't know, because we understand that after coming out. Whoa, my ears just went crazy right now.
Tinnitus affects us all, brother.
No, it's not tinnitus. It's like I just heard the world in HD for a second.
Woo.
Um, in reality,
Risk
most
takers are
people
different. Yeah.
understand that we are not going to where we are going subconsciously, but the reason that you get into it with some sense of comfort is because you expect, and that expectancy is creating this image for you. And so
Yeah.
when you have that image for you, you're going towards what you think you're going towards, but you still are going towards uncharted reality, in your words.
Yeah. So the reason I use that particular terminology is because um, in many ways we do you know how the thrill of the chase and this honeymoon period and all of that,
Yeah.
the reason our chemicals are so heightened in the beginning when we find shiny new things and we're always looking for the next best thing, no matter if it's materialistic or um, pseudo materialistic in the way that we treat modern relationships. It is something that I like to call pseudo materialistic, where there is an element of I want the thrill, and when the thrill dies down is when you really start to understand whether you're coming from a position of actual um, expectation, or you've just been you're just looking for that short-term gratification. You've got it. That's a reward. You're done with it. So most relationships are geared towards always moving towards the uncharted, because the uncharted, even though it's a predictable place that you might want to reach, there's still it's still uncharted for each individual that's exploring it. So my definition of uncharted in terms of each of my relationships would have been different, although I still know it's still predictable that I am leading into the uncharted. There is a familiarity that, okay, there is like this honeymoon period and there is going to be an influx of emotions in the beginning, and then eventually it's going to turn south at some point, or it might not turn south. But in neither of those cases am I ever looking for comfort. It's never coming from a place of the driving force isn't comfort. The driving force is always moving towards the uncharted. The driving force is always trying to stay in that uncharted for the longest period of time while still
And
maintaining balance.
that could very well be the thing that you can't live without. And so that's why you
It could
compulsively give
be.
it.
But maybe that's where I derive the gratification from.
Yeah, and
But
that's exactly what I'm saying. So if you weren't able to gratify yourself in that manner, that means that you aren't able to do it non-compulsively.
yeah, and then that would mean that you just there would be no driving force, and without that gratification, without that driving force, there would be nothing to propel you forward. So
I disagree. I think in your situation you've been programmed in a way that that's your driving force. So any other driving force you can't open yourself up to right now. But in many situations you, well, just from the mere fact that you understand your driving force and my driving force are different and everybody
yeah,
else's driving forces are different,
yeah,
just that allows you to understand that there's weaknesses in or lapses in people's psychologies that they compulsively want somebody to fill. And in that expectation lies the thrill. Because let's talk about why the thrill dies in a very surface way. When you meet
yeah,
somebody for the first time, there's mystery. And in that mystery, you have the opportunity to imagine. And when you imagine all these things, you have that narrative that you are building for yourself. And when you build it, you will build it in the best way possible, in the most mysterious way possible, in the most exciting way possible. But the more you start to get to know them, these imaginations start to die down because you get more and more information from them. And so when that dies down, if it does die down, then that's where the gratification starts to lose control. And so if your aspect of that weakness and that lapse that we're talking about isn't getting filled at that same time, then you will start to receive less and less dopamine from that interaction.
yeah.
And then that will in turn lead to some point in the future, if you hold on to it too tightly, where you receive a loss. And then that loss is guided by the expectations that you already had. And that expectation is very well linked to that thrill that you created yourself.
I'm trying to relate it to a materialistic analogy to make it a little bit easier, because we're talking on a scale of something that there's too many variables that we're talking about. So just to put things very clear, if we were to think about something, say this vape, for example, which is a hit of dopamine, and if we use it as a reasonable parable to be like, okay, I've invested £6 in buying this vape, so that's my percentage from the 100% currency that I've spent to now purchase something that, or to invest in something that's going to give me some form of gratification, with the expectation that I'm going to get some form of gratification, be it a dopamine hit or flavor or whatever. that's going to then gratify me. So the expectation still exists. So now, by your, for me, that was the driving force that led me to invest in the thing that let me buy the object. And when the vape runs out, or when it starts losing flavor, let's say that's the end of the honeymoon period for me in the vape. Eventually, I'm going to start questioning: do I keep smoking this or not? Because do I just stand by the fact that I've invested £6 in this, or do I just
This is
move along?
that's the perfect example to take actually, and I've understood your point already.
Yep,
The motivation of you wanting to buy the vape is why you bought it, right? Whatever that motivation is.
that's my
Once
driving
that
force.
Yes, exactly. So once that vape is over, you can choose two things. You can choose to understand that that vape is over, so now that honeymoon phase is over. So which means that each vape that you buy has a limited, it has an expiry date, right?
Yep, yep,
And you can also realize that if you want that same feeling again, that you're going to have to only buy a vape. You're not going to get that feeling with anything else. So
yeah.
that lapse that I'm talking about and that weakness that I'm talking about for you is going to be genrefied with the vape.
Mm.
Because you can spend £6 on anything. You can spend £6 on an ounce of cocaine, or I don't even know how much it costs, but probably not that less.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um,
I was gonna say.
you can you can spend that money anywhere and get some kind of dopamine anywhere. You can buy a packet of crisps, for example, but you won't feel what you're feeling with the vape. So what when you relate this analogy to what we're talking about, I'm saying your genre for finding someone is the same notion, or is it's the same quality that you have to look for the vape again to give you the same type of
Yeah,
satisfaction for the lapse that you have created.
yeah,
So what I'm trying to say is that once you understand that that vape is what is causing that uh, lapse again and again, and especially when you keep filling that same hole, you're digging yourself deeper and deeper and deeper. So the
yeah,
more vapes you smoke, let's say someone who smoked one vape compared to somebody who smoked 100 vapes is much easier, is much closer to quitting than someone who's smoked 100 vapes, and that's just
yeah.
fact. So of course, it depends subjectively, but on a general basis, that's fact. In that sense, what you're doing is you have paved your own path to create satisfaction for yourself. So you have programmed yourself to receive satisfaction from one topic, from one thing, right? And so in relationships, it's the same thing. Everybody has at least in society, everybody has a certain hole in general, on a large hole for relationships. And in that, there's a subsect of what people want, what kind of hole, right? Like the shape of your hole is different from the shape of my hole. So the shape of your hole will keep repeating itself with each partner. You understand what I'm saying?
I do. Yeah, it's
The
funny. Because
liquid,
I was laughing
like,
because that's exactly where I was getting to with your analogy. It's like I knew exactly that's where it was going to go. Now, so okay, let's take that as the basis and then build on whether I want to keep replacing things in this hole, which is not what I want to do, because I still feel like my driving force isn't necessarily to refill that hole. For example, using the vape analogy, I don't really. The only reason I have a vape is because I can't smoke indoors. So I actually prefer cigarettes more likely than not. So I would rather be smoking cigarettes. Which now, if we use the analogy of gratitude and being, dopamine hits and all that, let's say the ultimate objective for both of those things are the same. The vape or the cigarette is just I'm getting a dopamine hit, although the degrees vary. And now I also now have a preference of what I want. I'd rather do a cigarette than a vape, but now I'm settling for the vape because it's more comfortable for me. So
well,
now I can say,
the overall whole is the oral fixation and the nicotine deprivation.
yeah, the oral fixation, yes, I could say that. So I wouldn't necessarily say that the oral fixation equivalent to my seeking a relation or me seeking relationships is not the equivalent of filling my oral fixation. Um, I feel like there is a subliminal driver still that wants me to push and seek these
Yeah,
uncharted situations. I don't
yeah.
know. I don't. it might be the fact that I just want to be present in that uncharted territory for a prolonged period of time. Maybe that's what I want, but that it would have solidified the notion in my mind if all I was looking for was the honeymoon period. That would have made so much sense, and
Yes,
everything would have
because
fit.
so here's what I hear from you, right? The hole that you have, of course, it's hard to understand what the hole is, because if you did, then you wouldn't have that hole anymore. You would consciously try to cement it. So hole is hard to find, but you innately know that there is some way to fill liquid into it so that it covers that hole. But it is still liquid, and that liquid will slowly evaporate.
Yeah.
But the way that the shape of the liquid that's taking place, you just know it. You don't need to intellectualize it, but you feel it. And so in that honeymoon phase that you're talking about, that hole is somehow filled. It could be filled with silicon, it could be filled with water, it could be filled with shit, but it's still
Hmm.
filled. And
Hmm.
so that filled hole
Or that
is,
the feeling of like
it gives you a,
filling.
yes, it gives you a filling feeling.
Oh,
And so that filling
yeah.
feeling is basically the equivalent of you hitting a vape.
Ah, yeah. The fulfillment, in other words,
Yes,
is what
yes,
I'm looking for.
yes.
Well, yeah, I suppose that's what it is, and yeah, to a large degree, that fulfillment is the reciprocity that I keep looking for as well. So in a very long and convoluted way, I suppose my ultimate goal is just to keep finding something to fill that space, not necessarily through a relationship per se, but
Yes.
in some way, shape, or form,
Yeah.
whatever at the time. Like the analogy that you used was perfect. Is it doesn't have to be silicone or water or any other kind of fluid. It could be anything as long as that hole is filled for that time
Mm,
being. And then my objective then is to keep that hole filled for the longest period of time, which is why sometimes I catch myself needing to revel in if I'm brooding and the brooding is filling my hole, if I'm writing, the writing is filling my hole, or if I'm songwriting or if I'm fighting or if I'm training and that's what's filling my hole, I tend to latch onto it for a longer period of time until
yes.
something else fills the hole in a little bit better way. And then I'm like, oh, this
Yes.
is now my fixation. So the
Yes.
fixation still exists. It's just I'm thirsty for. I'm just this is just painting me out to be like the thirstiest man on the planet. But hey,
No,
I
well,
suppose that's what
no,
it is.
that's funny, but that's funny. I said it's funny, but I didn't laugh. That's the stupid thing. It's
Oh,
it's how most human beings live nowadays, and I think it's when it comes to your conscious understanding that there are all these holes that are created, right? I think the
yeah,
holes that are created exist only in psychology. And this psychology is also created by us. And so that leads me to the topic of identity. When you have a certain identity, whether you've shaped it yourself or whether you've shaped it to society, whether society has shaped it for you, these holes are present in everybody, but we don't recognize how deep the hole is. We've just filled it with shit, right? And we constantly try to refill it with shit, but it's evaporating at the same time. Because if you want to truly fill it, I think by the understanding of psychology, you can't. Because it is already a psychological existence. It's not a real existence. The fact that you can paint a picture of what your character is, the fact that you are stuck in painting that picture, if you are inside that picture, you can't see the picture like how you would see it from the outside. Do you understand what I'm saying?
yeah, yeah,
So most people, when I'm looking at people, I see, and even in my own experience, you see that because of certain reasons that I want to get into, the way that you sit inside this picture and you view life, you cannot see the holes being filled with what it's filled with. But you are constantly trying to fill these holes
yeah,
because the human body innately understands that there are these holes, and those holes, they communicate to you in the forms of chemicals. They communicate to you in the forms of just how you are physically existing. Like, say for example, being anxious, being depressed, being sad. All these things are chemical feelings and the state of chemistry that you are in at that moment. But also they can be programmed and they can have certain neurological routes to being released in certain ways, and not being released in certain ways. And all those things are programmed by the way that identity has been placed upon you, what your picture is. Exactly what I was saying when you cut out was the fact that um, the wholes that are created are chemical states of being. It's your chemistry at that moment. It's a state of chemistry at that moment. So, for example, if you are, let's say you break up with somebody and you have like a certain reaction to it and you have a certain state of mind to it, it's 1000% guided by what the state of your chemistry is at that moment. As in, the psychological situation that you're going through is very capable of defining the state of chemistry that you will be in. As in, will you be sad? Will you be depressed? Will you be anxious? These are all chemical states of physicality, right? So when these wholes and these identities are being uh, are guiding that, and we are seeing that these chemical states of being are the that
The
word
reciprocity.
reciprocities of that,
Yeah,
then
yeah.
it's easier to see from a drawn out perspective what it looks like. But when you're in that picture, you will constantly, perpetually try to fill these holes with whatever you think it needs to be filled with. But at the end of the day, it will still be a chemical state.
So this is you've chosen the chemical state of the body and the psychology at the minute to be the stimulus that then guides what you choose to fill these holes. But I think it works the other way around. I think the stimulus, the way that you react to certain situations, is what then determines your chemical state and then
Yes, that's what I'm
determines what
saying.
you.
That's
Yeah.
what I'm saying.
So what we're saying, what we're basically getting at, is that the identity then is built by whatever the most prominent stimulus at the time is, which will then guide what your body's state is going to be and how straight away it is from its natural state and where you want to bring it back, and therefore you will
Yes,
now build your.
that's the point. But the question is, where does the prominence come from?
Well, the prominence
What?
comes
Why
from
is that
the
prominent?
The prominence comes from the weight or the amount of substance or value that we associate to certain stimuli. So
Yes.
we'll feel we react differently into different in varying degrees to varying stimuli. So you use the example of breaking up with somebody, which puts the person involved in a state of emotional distress, and obviously it comes from a place of dejection and from a place of now loss, moving from fear of loss to actual loss, and this feeling of abandonment. So it's all puts the body in a very depressive and vulnerable state. It's vulnerable and depressed at the same time. So that would be a heightened that would incur a heightened response. And since it incurs a heightened response, the damage or the effect on the identity would be more drastic. You'd see the
Well,
person
so
go through more.
basically, what we're saying is that, say, the prominence that you're talking about is
Yeah,
basically the color palette of your picture, of your painting, right?
yeah,
So if you're if you are trying to receive something from a certain relationship to make you feel like you are filling that hole, then you
yeah.
are basically searching for, if there's a lot of brown in your painting, then you want to search for supplemental colors. So you're going to search for supplemental genres of liquid to fill that hole. And
I mean,
so,
not
yeah,
Not necessarily, because what if the you don't like the color brown? What if you realize that the color brown is filling the hole, but at the same time you come across the color yellow, which fills it better?
it doesn't matter because you're still painting a picture.
You
Then
are still
your
painting a
pictures
picture.
will
Yeah.
change. Your picture will change. The picture will
Yeah, yeah.
always keep changing. And the colors can change. You can repaint over
Oh,
this
okay,
picture
okay,
a
okay.
thousand times.
I was thinking the picture was constant. You're just trying to find what color fits best in the picture. So if the picture changes, then the color that fits the picture also changes.
Yes, it depends on
Yeah,
how
yeah, yeah.
you paint over it, right?
Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah, yeah.
the main issue isn't the fact that you're painting over it. I mean, the main issue isn't the fact that you can find different colors to fit it. At the end of the day, all these different colors can fill everything, right? Your
Yeah.
psychology can dictate exactly how you feel. But if you are living in that sector of your mind that is able to just living this amazing imagination creatively created by you are ignoring the facets of the human animal that are reacting to that. So it's not a two-way street for most people. It's a one-way street. The one-way street is the painting. People can paint over your painting, or you can paint over your painting and you can change it, and then the human animal reacts to that. And then
Yeah,
because
yeah,
you are in that painting and you are not observing the painter itself,
yeah,
you are not able to understand what the full painting looks like. And so a hole
yeah,
for you, you cannot see that hole. It just feels like a hole.
yeah. Okay, so the lack of a third person observer is what sets apart. So because we just know that the whole exists, we just don't know the shape, the size, the utility, nothing. We just
Exactly.
know that it exists. But for if we had the ability, which we can, um, produce that ability or induce that ability in ourselves. But if we don't separate ourselves from the actual painter and then put ourselves in the position of a third person observer who's looking at the painter painting the picture, we're not going to know the dimensions of the whole. We're not going to know the
Mm,
specifications. Therefore, we're not going to know exactly what it is that we need
mm.
to tackle or what we're tackling. So there is a sense of we're painting over something that we don't know. Therefore, that's that sense of unchartedness that we feel that we were talking about
I wouldn't
earlier.
even say that we are painting over it because that line gives you a sense of control. I don't think we are painting over it. I think we are slipping on paint in this imaginary picture that we have. People
Mm.
can paint over it for you. Like, so your painting and my painting can interact with each other. As in, what I'm really trying to say, if we're moving away from the analogy and bringing it back to
Yeah, yeah,
the reality of what we're discussing, is the fact that Sahas and Sandeep can
yep,
interact with each other, and I can
yeah.
paint on your picture and you can paint on my picture. But if you think that you are painting on your picture by will, that's essentially saying that you have control over the picture. But I digress from that. I don't think
Oh
that that's
yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I see what you mean.
And
Yeah,
so
yeah,
this is why we've spoken about this before, but a thing that I say a lot is to view yourself in a third person perspective. And this is a very surface way of how I got into meditation, right? How I
yeah,
got into moving into understanding that the psychology and the reality that you are creating for yourself outside of what is existential reality is um very hard to escape for most people because those practices, you are constantly digging that hole again and again. So you are so deep into this picture that it's hard to see it from the third person
yeah,
perspective.
yeah,
But the more
yeah,
that
yeah,
you
yeah,
train this, the more that you understand that, look, I am going to observe myself just sitting here. And I don't mean even just in a mental perspective. I'm talking about a really large third person perspective, as in you can sit here without closing your eyes or even with closing your eyes. It doesn't matter what you're doing with your body. You don't need to assume a position of meditation. These things are very corrupted in today's world, and especially on the western side of the world. Like, you hear a lot of people thinking that meditation is to sit in a certain position and to assume all these spiritual looking things. That's just not how it works. It's to
mm,
understand that the human is available to these facets that we have. And I keep using these words facets because that's we have these tools available to us. One of those tools is to understand that you can exit that picture at any moment.
mm-hmm.
To exit that picture, one, you need to fully believe it, right? But before you believe it, I'm not a proponent of telling anyone to believe anything, because I think that the word belief itself is a very uh,
It's a loaded word.
it's it's a loaded word, but it can be simply defined as a psychological crutch. If you need to believe in something, that means that you are depending on a prediction, which
Yeah, yeah,
is
yeah.
it's not fruitful in any way. It's just you are again in that picture trying
Mm,
to
mm-hmm.
convince yourself of something. So instead of believing of something, what I'm trying to say is when you assume a third person perspective, uh, and I want to get into it in another podcast where we speak deeply about what meditation is. Um, and the word meditation itself doesn't really define anything. You really have to use terms that define certain specific tools of the body to understand how to slip into the state of meditation. You cannot meditate and become in that state.
Yeah.
But when you assume that third person position and you're looking at yourself from a different angle, a lot of people think that they can look back at themselves look back at their identities. You cannot
Mm.
look back at your own identity with an identity.
Mm.
You can try to look at the picture that you painted in the last 20 years, right? You
Yeah.
can you can look at the past painting, you can look at the transformation of the painting, but you will look at it from inside the painting if you are looking at it as Sandeep.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So if you're going to try to solve any of these issues that you have psychologically, especially what we were talking about just now, if you try to look at it from inside the painting, then you will not see the whole
Yeah.
painting. So you will change those colors like we were speaking about. You will look back and you will say, "Oh, brown didn't fit well for me, so I'm going to use purple." And then you will
Mm.
change brown to purple, and then you will understand that purple doesn't fit well anymore, and then you keep doing that the rest of your life, and you will get stuck in that psychological reality. But in reality, the whole time that you're in that painting, something is reacting to it and something is responding to it, which is literally your chemistry, and your neurological circuits are being like molded again and again and again because you are not recognizing what it is. And not only that, you are more prone to falling into the same circles again and again because you are creating momentum for it and you are creating the
Yeah. Yeah.
divots. It's easier to fall into that divot
Yeah.
again.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's well, I've kind of figured out how to do this very early on in my life as
Wait,
well.
wait,
But
wait. Sorry to cut you off. I just wanted to end that with one like strong point. Was that when I was talking about divots, right? These divots that I'm saying you can fall easier into again and again. When we were talking about the genre of what fulfills that hole and what fulfills that hole, that's what I'm talking about when I say that. Like you might understand that, but the divots that I'm talking about is what we were initially talking about, the genre of what you're looking for, what fills your
mm,
hole, what you think fills your hole. And so you
yeah.
will fall to what is most easily known to fill your hole. So in this situation with the analogy of the vape, you think that the vape fills your hole the easiest at this point for whatever that hole is at that moment. So you will find the vape and you'll hit the vape, but uh, it will be easier to hit the vape again and again because now you know what's going to fill that exact hole.
Mm. Mm. So yeah, what I was saying was I've pretty much figured out the same thing that you're describing, but in a very different way because I never looked at the larger picture on a big scale. But I did manage to take that third person perspective very early on in my life because I found that was the easiest way to evaluate the situation and then try to figure out how to come to a consensus because there's no point trying to beat a dead horse. So for me to try to figure out what it is that I'm fucking up or where it is that I'm going wrong in any scenario, not necessarily in any particular specification, but in any scenario, the only way for me to figure out what to change, because the only thing that propels you forward is change. In order to find that out, I always had to assume the third person observer and then try to look at what's going on, but only for circumstance to circumstance to circumstance. So it was always when I needed to tap into that third person observer, I would then tap into it just to see how to solve that particular situation. But what I'm trying to say is that it might just be me looking at a small fraction of the whole and thinking, all right,
Mhm.
this is just like if the whole is composed of many subdivisions, I'm at a particular subdivision that I need to sort out before I move into the next subdivision. So I essentially what I'm doing is I am still working towards the goal of filling that hole properly, but instead of filling it all at once, what I'm doing is I'm filling each segment of that hole all at once, and then realizing that when I get to a certain segment that I'm getting stuck. So essentially I'm filling my hole with different material at each segment. It's getting filled, but then when I go back to, let's say if I get to the seventh rung of the ladder of 10 segments and I say that, oh, the third the third segment that I filled my hole with is now starting to crack because what I observed at the time didn't give me the full picture because I wasn't observing the whole hole. And now I need to go and fix that third segment. All the segments between 7 and 3 are going to collapse upon itself. So now I'm back to the
So
second segment all the way.
this is the issue why I'm saying you have to fill it from a different perspective. The way that you explain that is exactly how it would be if you were to look at the painting from inside the painting. Let's
Yeah,
Let me explain why I'm saying the hole cannot be filled ever. It's never going to be
right.
filled. but if you look back and you want to fill that hole, because the hole that is created, right, is only a hole when you're looking at it from inside the painting. That feeling that you have to understand that that was a hole, and the desire to fill that hole itself is something that your psychology wants. If you were truly in a third person perspective at that point, you wouldn't feel the need to fill that hole, and you would simply observe your chemical state and observe that that is a hole in my psychology, and that hole has been created somehow, and that's it. In the desire to try and fill that hole with more psychological external situations or external colors, you are creating more and more holes. And not only that, you will create holes in the same characteristic that you have created them before, because it's easier to do it in that
Yeah,
same
because of the
pattern.
divots. Yeah, that you're
So
talking
the
about because it
only
becomes
way to
momentum.
really, yes, exactly. The only way to really step out in the person perspective is to truly understand that you cannot fill these holes. These holes do not exist. Those holes are still in the painting that you are seeing, but you will really have to escape that painting and live on a physical and chemical level and a self-aware level, and not in a psychological level, because then they're
But
not holes anymore. They're
but that's
simply
such
to
a
observe that there's different chemical states.
but that's such a tall order to ask, isn't it? Is just to be able to not only
Yes.
observe the whole completely and absolutely from a third perspective, but also to observe everything that you have in that whole. Obviously, I'm not saying that you need to try to fill it, but just to notice that the whole exists and just to identify to the best of your abilities
Can I stop
what
you
the
real
nature of
quick?
the.
Can I
Yeah,
stop
go on.
you real quick? The reason it looks tall and the reason it looks large is because you're inside the painting. What happens when you are inside the painting? Everything looks huge to you.
That's
When
true,
you
but
exit the painting, you just look at it as a canvas. So the
yeah,
painting is really small.
I'm saying just the idea of asking someone to exit the painting is a tall order. I'm
For
saying
somebody
there's.
who, yeah, yes, 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 I agree. I see what you're saying.
Yeah, it's
For
not
somebody who's
just the.
outside the painting, it doesn't seem small.
Yeah, so just observing the painting is beyond. That's not fruitful. We've already touched upon plenty of times. Is that there's nothing fruitful about trying to look at the whole from the inside and then trying to even attempt to fill it. But just asking someone to be like, oh, you need to go on the third perspective and then try to fill that hole in. Try to observe that hole first and then see completely. Well, once you get to that state, everything becomes easier because the difficulty lies in just removing yourself from that painting and then looking at it from the top
Yeah.
in and of itself.
So the question is, how do you remove yourself from that
Yeah,
painting?
this is what I was going to
It's
ask
not
you.
as
So how do you
simple.
do it?
It's not as simple as saying just exit the painting and look at it from a whole person perspective. But what is important to understand before you even want to exit that painting is to understand that you are in a painting. Let's assume
Hmm.
that people who are listening have understood that you're in that painting. If you understand that there is a painting at all and you don't see it as reality, then that's the first step, right? If you are in
Yeah.
the painting and you don't realize that there is a painting and that is just reality, the way that you view life, then you're already doomed, right? Like you can't help someone. So that's the first thing to realize, that you're in a painting. Second thing to realize, if you are in a painting, what are you what is existential reality? Existential reality would then, there will be a couple options, right? I know what I'm trying to say, but just for the sake of argument, I'm going to bring up a couple options. If you are escaping the painting that we're calling psychological reality, what
Hmm.
influences psychology and what does psychology influence?
Hmm. So if you want to talk about what psychology influences what it's influenced by, obviously, like I was touching upon earlier, is the stimulus and the way that you react to a certain stimulus, and the gravity of each stimulus will determine then what your response is going to be, and therefore what degree or what psychological state you're going to be. What the psychological reality then influences is obviously the way that your body, the biochemistry works, where you're going to build momentum, whether you're going to build some kind of momentum or you're just going to be at a standstill. All of those things is then something you have to consider. But it all starts from the same linear pathway of three like standard items, which is like a stimulus, a response, and then a function or an effect or an effect or an effector.
Even more basic than that, I what psychology affects is, like you said, your chemical state. Yeah, your chemical state affects your physical state, and vice versa. That's a loop by itself. Your physical state
Mm,
affects your chemical, chemical affects your physical. So as long as you're living in this psychology, it will keep repeating itself, and that's why you see the same things happen to you in the same ways that it happens again and again, until you escape that. So we've understood that it affects physical and affects your chemistry, and I'm only separating them. In reality, they're one thing, but I'm only separating them for the sake of ease of understanding. But the more major thing is memory that it affects. It affects your memory because you have memory that is independent of psychological memory. It's independent of how much you can imagine and store. You have memory in the terms of neurological patterns. You have the memory in the form of your DNA. You have memory in the form of genetic memory, right? You have, I guess, DNA and genetic memory go hand in hand. I think, or the
it's
same exact
literally the
thing.
same thing. Yeah.
But yeah, so it is the same thing. So there's memory like that, and there's memory that's in your subconscious. There's memory in your conscious. There's memory in metaphorical understandings. Like there's secondary memories. Like one thing can trigger another thing. It can trigger another thing,
Yeah.
and I'm
Yeah.
only
Yeah.
making
Yeah.
it easier to understand.
Like memory
So
pathways.
yeah, so clearly, if it's affecting your chemicals, that means it's affecting, in the analogy of the divots that we use, it's affecting the memory of your chemicals also. So your chemicals, since they have a certain memory in your the way that your neurons fire, it will continue to fire in us in that inertia as long as you are in the same psychological state of mind. So once you change it, you have to break free from that inertia.
Mm,
So that's one thing, right? So
mm-hmm.
a lot of people, when they have psychological issues, they will turn back and they will realize what the issue is, that they fell into that problem, and they will change it. Most people, nowadays, at least with the issues that they have and with the questions that I keep getting, is that it's really hard to break from that inertia. One thing to break from that inertia is 1000% discipline. You need discipline to break free from that
Yeah.
inertia. You need escape velocity, right? Second thing is, once you escape that, if you are going too fast, you will create inertia in the opposite direction.
Mm-hmm.
And if you are successful at breaking free from the inertia that you have created for 22 years, and this is only in your reality that I'm speaking of, there's inertia of momentum. I mean, there's inertia of evolution, which is why in the promo video, the line that I say is to observe and understand the extent of the universe within ourselves. If we don't observe and understand the extent of the universe within ourselves, then we are slaves to the momentum of evolution, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Which means evolution has its own inertia that is working, whether you live in
Like it
for
or
like
not. Yeah.
20 years or 100 years. It doesn't matter how long you live,
Yeah.
your
Yeah.
sons will have that inertia, your children will have that inertia. And that's one form of inertia, and that's the larger picture of inertia, right? But before I
Yeah.
even
Yeah.
like scare anyone with that thunderous storm, the inertia that you create yourself with your psychology is already taking place, and you're already a slave to that. So to exit that, you need that escape velocity, but then you'll create more inertia if you don't have control over it. So the next step is to gain control over observation first.
Yeah.
One is to escape that psychological reality, and that's a hard task in itself. But to observe what you are doing after that is a whole other task, because each time you try to observe something, you're going to fall in these divots again and again. So some people might be, some people might trick themselves into thinking they're meditating, and they'll sit down and they'll do de-stressing practices, which is like fucking absurd to me, because de-stressing is the stupidest thing I've heard. Why would you stress yourself out in the first place if you want to de-stress? It's so normal. So everybody thinks that after you stress, you like, it's okay, stress is normal in life and it's just a part of life, and then you have to de-stress. Like, you fucking stupid. There's a way that the human body functions, and if you learn how to not stress in the first place, then you don't need to combat this is what I'm saying. You build
Yeah.
inertia and then you try to combat inertia,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
most people are unsuccessful with that combat.
Yeah.
combating inertia. And then like you just fall into this fucked up loop and you can't escape it. But even if you are successful, you will create more inertia. You
Yeah.
de-stress too much, then you won't be in a point where you're motivated enough to go do more work.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you are successful, which is a huge task. But to get back to the main point, to observe that in itself, most people will use certain practices to sort of de-stress and they're successful with it. And then they will observe it for a minute. But as soon as something stresses them out, and this is also a really cool topic to talk about, as soon as something stresses them out, they will uh, revert to the most comfortable orientation, which
Yeah.
means that they will find the closest divot to
Exactly. Yeah.
battling
I was about to
that
say.
situation.
Yeah, it's like so it's not comfort in the conventional sense. It's comfort as in what's most available, what's most
Self-defense.
readily. Yeah, it's what's most readily available as because that's the most momentum that they've built in that particular divot. So if you channel your momentum and you push your momentum in the right direction, that will then become your default sort of fallback on when you need to look, when you need to reach out for something or whatever the closest momentum is. If you're driving your momentum in the right direction, that then becomes your default. So automatically you're just propelling yourself forward and forward. And as you keep picking that positive momentum as your default, eventually you're going to create even more and more momentum. You're going to keep stacking momentum in that direction, and now eventually you have way more momentum to spend on different things as opposed to going back anywhere. So you don't have to put yourself in a position where you need to fight that tide or that momentum, and especially if it goes the other way around as well. If you build momentum in the negative direction, that is hence going to become your default. It's so interesting, this is, because that's exactly what I've been doing when I was talking about, and I can't remember which of these episodes I was talking about, the character that I built myself when I was 16. And for 5 years after that, I spent 5 years trying to combat that momentum where unknowingly I was just defaulting to the negative momentum that I was building myself and then pushing myself into a spiral. And my default position was then to pick that momentum because that was the one that was most readily available, that negative momentum. And then each time I picked that momentum, I kept thinking to myself, why am I still struggling? Because I'm trying. It took so much energy out of me, and my expectation at the time was, with the amount of energy that I'm spending trying to better myself, at this point, I should have been better. I've spent 5 years trying to fix it. But what I failed to realize is that whilst I was expending more and more energy, I was just defaulting to the same old negative momentum. So the only good thing that came out of that was I wasn't stacking negative momentum because I was spending more and more energy trying to combat that momentum. But ideally, my momentum was still in a net negative position, just not too negative.
Yes.
Where most
Yes.
people, when they don't even have that motivation and that self discipline to even try to combat this momentum, I can instantly see how easily people can lose themselves in this downward momentum spiral.
Yeah.
Because if they keep
But
pushing,
I would like to clarify that when we're looking at this at a whole perspective, right? um, there are some things that can cause negative emotions. There are some things that can cause positive emotions, right? People have inertia in both ways. If we were to look at that as negative downward spiraling and positive upward spiraling, we are creating bias again in a psychological way towards what the human animal can do. There's a reason that you are feeling that way from certain inertia, and there's a reason that you're feeling this way from certain inertia. It's just the nature of human biology, right? It's an immensely powerful tool that we can use, but once we start attaching bias to that fact that you can comfortably find the closest divot for self-defense, that's not necessarily a bad thing. So when you are in an actual stressful position that you are not creating for yourself, imagine the ability that a human being has to find the closest divot so instantly to fall back into to defend themselves. That's an immensely powerful tool to have. And so
yeah,
psychology is is immensely profound when you have control over it,
yeah,
right? It's a facet of the brain, or whatever it's a facet of. I would just say in general, it's the facet of the human animal that allows you to be incredibly creative about your emotions, incredibly creative about your physical state, but it'll predict and it'll also remember from the past. So it's a combination of memory, it's a combination of emotion, and it's a combination of your physical state at that point that all in turn create, and it's a combination of your ability to imagine, imagination. All of them together create the psychology, and which is why the painting is so profound to live in, which is why everybody has such an amazing time in life. Like, regardless of people going through regretful moments in life, you will hear most people say, I don't have any regrets, because it's still an amazing painting. At the end of the day, it still
Mm-hmm.
profoundly
Mm-hmm.
impacts you. Like, if you ask any old person, unless they're truly miserable, if even if they've gone through homelessness, even if they've gone through multiple people in their lives dying, they will say, I don't regret it, because it's such a meaningful painting. It can teach you so many things in life, and can also, instead of using the word teaching, I would just say it can impact you in so many amazing ways. It's entertainment at the end of the day, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I don't, for the people who are viewing and don't quite understand what I'm saying, please go back and watch this whole podcast and see how I'm coming to this place. I am not saying that your life is only entertainment. I am not saying that the closest relationships in your life and when people die are entertainment. But I'm saying your ability to imagine and your ability to predict and also remember the past and live in this way where the story in the movie that you're living is impactful is entertainment. Entertainment is not necessarily a derogative term. It's a profound term in the realization that human animals can live in this second reality that we can create.
Yeah.
But the problem comes when you're enslaved to that reality.
Yeah.
So it's important to understand not to give a negative emotion to the aspect of you being able to become lazy instantly or become anxious instantly. These are all beautiful characteristics that you are available to,
Yeah. Rather just
but you just
recognize
don't
the
know how to
fact that
use it.
exactly. Rather, you just recognize that you have the ability to default at all, and you have the
Yeah.
ability to kind of express and experience these emotions at all. And there's so much strength that goes into it. And now, once you recognize that there is strength in that, you now have immense power and drive that you can develop to try to influence that in the way that you want to at the
Mhm.
time. And that is what it truly means to, you know, say scratch the tip of the iceberg of what it means to utilize the many facets of the human animal. This is just a small subdivision of a small fraction of what it means to be in control of the human animal. And already all of this is just so fascinating. And already most of this is, I'm pretty sure most of this is so relatable to people as it is. And it's just that, it's something that people would have felt, they would have thought about, they would have been like, oh yeah, it irks some kind of memory, but they wouldn't have been able to either phrase it or they wouldn't have been able to sort of come out and talk about it. But just the fact that people were able to imagine this and just the fact that people may be able to sort of relate to this is testament to the fact that the human animal is so powerful beyond our imagination, and we're just refusing to tap into the potential of this amazing creature.
Absolutely. Well, with that, I think we can end this podcast on a good note. But just to
Mm,
conclude, I would like to say that the human animal is capable of creating psychological realities. We're able to live in it, and we're able to live a very imaginative and creative life in this. And it impacts us profoundly in the form of chemicals. It impacts us in the form of our chemistry, our state of chemistry, which means that as much as you love your imagination, as much as you love your identity, and you live in this identity, you will be posed to having chemical states being reflecting your state of psychology as well. So your state of chemicals is directly related to your state of psychology. For you to decode that from a standpoint of psychology is nearly impossible, which is why people need therapists so that they can view them in a third person perspective. But
mm,
here's what I have against therapists, right? When, say for example, you have an issue, you're in your psychological reality. You come to me because maybe I can see your painting in a further perspective, right? And so because I can see it in a more zoomed out perspective, I can offer you advice for things that you cannot see, which I
Mm-hmm.
completely agree. This happens on a daily basis to me with the people I meet, and it happens on a daily basis with some things that I wasn't able to see in the past. And because of that, it can help you, and it can definitely nudge you in a certain way. So let's say I was able to see one of your dips and divots in your life and the holes that you're trying to fill, and I tell you, hey man, this is one hole that you have. Maybe you can realize, and just in that realization, you already filled that hole
Mm-hmm.
psychologically, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the person who's giving you advice, if they are also in a psychological slavery, then you're fucked.
Mm-hmm.
Because not only will they give you advice pertaining to their own psychology that they cannot escape, unless they are to listen to escape that version of your psychology and to be in constant observation of that requires immense amount of work. It's not easy. And the practice is when somebody truly understands that you are viewing life from a animalistic perspective, not a psychological perspective, it's completely recognizable. You can find
Mm-hmm.
that person in a whole crowd of 1 million people. It's way too recognizable. Just on the face of that person, you can see that he doesn't live in a psychological reality. The rarity of that is high, right? And to find a therapist like that is very, very rare. So, in case that there are therapists like that, or there are people like that who have chosen to become a therapist because they feel like they can help people, fine. I don't have anything against them. But, unless I can certify for a fact that they are like that, I still have something against the form of psychological therapy in that aspect of it, because you are battling psychological issues with more psychological advice, and that's just redundant to me, which I
Mm-hmm.
think is a comes with a great deal of responsibility.
Yeah.
And for me to have seen the psychologists that I've met in my life, which is plenty, I have never observed not one that can really look at their own psychology from a very drawn out perspective and in the way that I'm talking about. If this
Yeah.
gets clipped and they hear that I'm talking about this, it won't make sense. You need to watch this whole podcast to understand what I'm saying. If you cannot escape your psychological reality in the way that I explained in this podcast, there is no way that you can accurately help someone get out of their psychological issues. You have to use the mind and the body to remove yourself from imagination. You cannot use
Absolutely. Yeah.
imagination to battle more imagination.
Yeah. You're fighting a losing battle at that point because you're not using the. Not only are you not using all of your facets, you're just crippling yourself by using the same facet over and over again. And yeah, that does lead into redundancy, and it's not going to amount to anything. It's literally Einstein's definition of insanity. You're just repeating the same thing, trying to fight it with fire, and you're not going to get anywhere. You need to change some to get into some sort of progressive movement forward and push forward. And yeah, I think you're absolutely right when you say that. But yeah, the the whole takeaway mostly is from an individual standpoint, it's very important for you to first recognize these things and to recognize that, understand that just the fact that you can recognize these things has so much power within it. And then imagine the amount of power you can then derive from being able to manipulate it the way that you want, the way that you should, as the wonderful creature that you are. So it's just such a thrilling idea. It's amazing.
It's amazing. We're only 1% through with the amount of topics that we have to discuss. But
Hmm.
the reason that the first few podcasts are about this, and this in itself is a very heavy topic to be in the initial states of this podcast. But these are things that you slowly need to understand to even ponder if you are going to evolve or not. Because
Yeah,
what the subjects that we have spoken about in the last few podcasts is what is limiting you from observing and understanding how much you can evolve.
pretty much. Yeah.
And then when you eventually escape it, which is going to take a lot of effort, then you can actually think of shit that makes you evolve. So,
This is
yeah, get this through your head, I guess. So that's a bombshell we just dropped today.
it's always a pleasure talking to you. This is amazing. It's been amazing as
Likewise.
always.
Likewise.
So catch you in the next one with a more interesting topic then.
All right.
See you
Peace,
later,
brother.
bud.